Braja Janaranjana Yamunatiravanacharya Tiravanacharya Yamunatiravanacharya Tiravanacharya Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Vihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Vihari Jaya Gopi Jannavalabha Girivaradari Jaya Gopi Jannavalabha Girivaradari Yashodanandana Braja Janaranjanam Yashodanandana Braja Janaranjanam Yamunatiravanacharya Tiravanacharya Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Vihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Vihari Shri Shri Radha Madhava Ki Jai Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam Ki Jai Shri Prabhupada Ki Jai. Wo ist Tejas? Hat es geklappt mit dem Livestream? Ich schätze mal, ich hoffe. So, we are reading from the Srimad Bhagavatam. Wer versteht kein Englisch? Du? Willst du übersetzen? Okay. So we'll speak in English. We're reading from the Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 3, Chapter 26, the Fundamental Principles of Material Nature, text 11 or 12? 12. Text 12. Please repeat. Maham Bhutani Panchaiva Mahabhutani Panchaiva Bhur Apo Agnir Marun Nabaha Bhurapognir Marun Nabaha Bhurapognir Marun Nabaha Tan Matrani Cha Tavanti Tan Matrani Cha Tavanti Tan Matrani Cha Tavanti Gandhadini Matani Matani Me Gandhadini Matani Me Mahabhutani Panchaiva Bhurapognir Marunnabaha Tanmatrani Chatavanti Gandhadini Matani Me Mahabhutani Panchaiva Bhurapognir Marunnabaha Tanmatrani Chatavanti Gandhadini Matani Me Panchaiva Bhutani Panchaiva Gandhadini Matani Me Mahabhutani Panchaiva Bhurapognir Marunnabaha Matrani Chatavanti Gandhadini Matani Me Mahabhutani Panchaiva Bhurapognir Marunnabaha Gandhadini Matani Me. Matajis, ladies. Mahabhutani Panchaiva Bhurapognir Varunnabaha Trani Tachavanti Mahabhutani Panchaiva Somebody else? Word by word, please repeat. Mahabhutani, the gross elements. Pancha, 5. Eva, exactly. Bhuhu, earth. Apaha, water. Agnihi, fire. Marut, air. Nabaha, ether. Tatmatrani, the subtle elements. Cha, also. Tavanti, so many. Gandha, Adini, smell and so on. Taste, color, touch and sound. Matani, considered. Me, by me. Translation. There are 5 gross elements, namely earth, water, fire, air, and ether. There are also 5 subtle elements, smell, taste, color, touch, and sound. So there's no purport, so we'll read the next verse. Text 13. Indriyani dasa shrotrang tvagdrigrasana nasikaha vakaro charano medrang payurda shama uchyate. Translation. The senses for acquiring knowledge and the organs for action number 10, namely the auditory sense, the sense of taste, the tactile sense, the sense of sight, the sense of smell, the active organ of speaking, the active organ of working, and those for traveling, generating, and evacuating. Again, no purport. So next verse, 14. Mano buddhira hankaras chitam ityantar atmakam chaturdha lakshyate bhedo vritya lakshana rupaya. The internal subtle senses are experienced as having 4 aspects, in the shape of mind, intelligence, and ego, and contaminated consciousness. Ego and contaminated consciousness. Distinctions between them can be made only by different functions, since they represent different characteristics. Again the verse. The internal subtle senses are experienced as having 4 aspects in the shape of mind, intelligence, ego, and contaminated consciousness. Distinctions between them can be made only by different functions, since they represent different characteristics. Purport. The 4 internal senses, or subtle senses, described herein are defined by different characteristics. When pure consciousness is polluted by material contamination, and when identification with the body becomes prominent, one is said to be situated under false ego. Consciousness is the function of the soul, and therefore behind consciousness there is soul. Consciousness polluted by material contamination is called ahankara. Om Agyana Timirandasya Gyanangyana Shalakaya Chakshurum Vidhitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobhistam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shayuta Parakamalam Shri Gurum Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Ragunatam Vitamtam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padam Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakam Vitamscha. He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dinabandhu Jagatpate Gopesha Gopipakanta Radhakanta Namostute Jayatam Surato Pangor Mamamanda Hamatirgati Matsarvasva Padambojo Radhamadana Mohanao Divyadvrindaranya Kalpadrumada Srimad Ratnangara Simhasanasto Srimad Radha Srila Govinda Deva Upreshtalivi Savyamanao Smarami Srimandra Sarasarambi Vamsiva Tatatastitaha Karsham Vino Svanair Gopir Gopinata Shriyastunaha Taptakanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavanishvari Vrishavano Sutadevi Pranamami Hari Priye Jai Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Garadhara Sivasari Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Read again the verses, only the translations. There are 5 gross elements, namely earth, water, fire, air, and ether. There are also 5 subtle elements, smell, taste, color, touch, and sound. the senses for acquiring knowledge, and the organs for action, number 10, namely the auditory sense, the sense of taste, the tactile sense, the sense of sight, the sense of smell, the active organ for speaking, the active organs for working, and those for traveling, generating, and evacuating. The internal subtle senses are experienced as having 4 aspects in the shape of mind, intelligence, ego, and contaminated consciousness. Distinctions between them can be made only by different functions, since they represent different characteristics. So this is a very, maybe this is like the core of the Sankhya Yoga. Those verses we are reading here are actually the core of Sankhya Yoga, which is one of the main topics in the 3rd canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam, where Kapila Muni is explaining how this entire material existence is made up. So Sankhya Yoga is the science, or you could say the philosophical process of observing and dissecting nature, understanding all its different components and how they interact. And in these verses here, good journey, kommt bald wieder, Joy, Hare Krishna, Jai. Gauranga, Jasira Mataji ki Jai. So yes, Sankhya means to count, to analyze, analytical yoga, you could say. And yoga is always directed towards reconnecting and recognizing the nature of the self. In the case of Sankhya Yoga, it's done very systematically by understanding, first of all, how everything came to be. So first of all, you could say the different ingredients are listed. The verses we have now, actually all of the verses we just read give a complete overview of the different elements that make up Sankhya Yoga. I think there were 23 elements. 23 elements. There's 5 gross elements. Then it says there's 5 subtle elements. Then we have another 10 sets of senses. So that's 20. And then technically here there's not 23 but 24. There's a distinction made between ego and contaminated consciousness. In the purport, Srila Prabhupada more or less says that contaminated consciousness is false ego, but for some reason there is a subtle distinction being made here. So 23, 24 elements, all these 24 elements are listed here. And you could say that when Srila Prabhupada, one of the main teachings, one of the main forms of enlightenment that Srila Prabhupada brought was that we are not this body. So we are not this body is a very sensible idea, and one can understand that, okay, I'm not this body, I'm the spirit soul, this is just a vehicle I'm using. But Sankhya Yoga then explains in great detail what we are not. In great detail, Sankhya Yoga explains, you could say in all levels of existence, that we are not the material body, because the material body is made up of all these elements that we just read about. And in the Yoga Sutras, also the same emphasis is there. It says that somebody who is self-realized, he has detachment and cognition and the ability of distinction on all the 7 planes of existence, it says. So on all the 7 planes is referring to the main 7 or 8 elements, if you don't count the false ego. So basically you could say, I'm not this body, but I'm not earth, I'm not the water, I'm not the fire, I'm not the air, I'm not the ether, and everything related to it, because it's all related. One very interesting item I found here that I never heard it in that way, or I didn't have it in my memory like that, but we have the 5 gross elements, earth, water, fire, air, and ether. And then the 5 subtle elements are the qualities by which we can perceive each one of these elements. So they are described here as the subtle elements. Generally, when we say the subtle elements, we tend to think there are the 5 gross elements, and then there are the 3 subtle elements, namely mind, intelligence, and false ego. But here the distinction is a little bit more refined, and those 3 subtle elements, mind, intelligence, and ego, here they're classified as internal subtle elements. And we have, you could say, external subtle elements, 5 in number, that are related to each one of the 5 gross elements. So, for example, earth can be perceived by smell, especially gandha. So, earth can be perceived by smell. And earth, being the most gross amongst the elements, can be perceived by all the other senses as well. So it's the most gross element. So you can smell it, but you can also taste earth. You can hear it. You can touch it. You can see it. So it can be perceived by all the 5 senses. Then we have water, which is related to taste. So water now, pure water has no smell. Pure water has no smell, but you can taste it. So it's a little bit more subtle. You can only perceive it by 4, you could say, qualities. It has, water has taste. You can also see water. You can feel water, and you can hear water. Then we have fire. Fire is more subtle than water. You cannot taste it anymore. It's not a good idea to try to taste fire. Only Hanuman was able to do it. You know the story of Hanuman? Hanuman, when he was a small baby Hanuman, he was asking, what is my food? Very important. You need to know what is my food, then you know how you survive. So he was told, anything that's round and red, and it's hanging, in trees or in the sky, that you can eat. So in the morning when he woke up, he was very hungry. He was very hungry, so he saw through the trees. He saw this red, ball. So he jumped through the tree and ate the sun. So Hanuman had this ability. He ate the sun, and then everything became dark. And then Indra, with his Vajra, with his thunderbolt, hit him on the jaw, and that's why he became known as Hanuman. He became unconscious, and then Varuna, Marut, the god of air, who was one of his fathers, choked the entire universe. No more air because you hurt my son. And then everybody pacified Marut, and then they all revived him and also blessed Hanuman with all kinds of mystical powers. So Hanuman is the original superhero. Spider-Man, Batman, they're all much, much later. And my speculation is that they took, because even the name, Spider-Man, Batman, Hanuman, Singiri Bhagwan ki jai. It even seems that they copied the style of the name, and they made out of one, superhero, they made many superheroes. Hanuman had all the superpowers. He had from all the single demigods, 33 crore, 33 million. From each one of them, he had a blessing. But being a small nutty boy, he actually started misusing these powers and was making all kinds of pranks. Sometimes he would, take an entire hill with all kinds of brahmanas and move it to a different place. So the brahmanas would wake up from their meditation and they would be completely confused, where they are. So he pushed it so far that the brahmanas cursed him to forget his powers until he met Ram. So he forgot all his powers until he met Ram. So besides Hanuman, not a good idea to try to taste fire. Fire is, of course, mainly characterized by its color. You can see it by its rupa, by shape. And you can also hear it, you can feel it as well. And then we have air, which now becomes invisible, but you can feel it and you can also hear it. And then finally we have ether, which is, the most subtle amongst the gross elements. And ether, for many people, it's not even an element. In some traditions, I think in China, they always only count the 4 elements, the 4 very obvious elements. Ether is already so subtle that it's sometimes, not acknowledged as an element. But in our list, certainly it's there. So ether is space. Also, it's a space. It's called space or sky. Sometimes also is translated. So basically, you could say ether contains all the other elements. It's the most subtle. And space is a good way to understand ether, because ether is characterized by sound. You cannot feel it. You can only hear it. So the bell. I hear the bell, so I know it's a small bell. Even I cannot feel it, touch it, see it, but I know it's a small bell because it sounds like a small bell. And if you are in a big room and you call out, or if you're in a canyon and you call out, and even if you're blind, when you hear the echo, you feel, oh, this is a big space. There's an echo. So ether can be understood by space and sound. You could say it's a space, the space that contains all the other elements. So this is the very basic understanding that ether is the most subtle amongst the elements, and being the most subtle of the elements, it's also the source of all the other elements. So we have this famous book, what is it called? Human devolution, human devolution. Because generally we hear about evolution, that from a very simple origin, everything became extremely complex. But actually, our idea is different. The idea that Bhagavatam presents is that there was this very complex origin, absolutely complex, impossible to completely understand. Krishna. It's described that Ananta Shesha, we have Ananta Shesha Vahana there, with its thousands of mouths, is glorifying and explaining Krishna, chanting the Vedas and explaining Krishna. And even Ananta Shesha, literally it means, Ananta, without end. Ananta Shesha is with its countless mouths glorifying and explaining transcendence, Krishna, but it never reaches a limit. So the source is the most complex, and then there's a devolution. That is now manifested as we see it here. So ether is amongst the gross elements, is the source of all the gross elements. From sound, all the gross elements are manifested. And sound, of course, appears in different categories as well. In 2 main categories, you could say. There's Shabda Brahman, and material Shabda, normal sound. But in any case, sound is extremely powerful. So just by hearing, you can have an experience of all the other elements. So this is then the next step into the next 10 elements. So we have then a division into the knowledge acquiring senses and the working senses. And first come the knowledge acquiring senses. So we have ether, the element. Then we have sound, the subtle element. And then we have an active sense, namely the ear. So with the ear, we can hear the sound in ether. With the ear, we can hear the sound in ether. And sound is therefore the most important, or you could say the ear is the most important amongst the organs, because the ear has the ability to perceive what all the other 5 senses perceive. So let's say like this, with your mouth, you can only eat. You can only also speak, but with the active part of, tasting, you can taste, You cannot really smell, you cannot really hear, etc. But with the nose, already you can to some extent taste. So when you smell something, you get an idea how it might taste. So the senses are, you could say, the more subtle they become, they actually also become more powerful. But especially the emphasis is always put on the ear and hearing. Just by hearing, you can have a full experience of all the other elements. You can hear a story and you can see it, you can feel it, you might even cry. So you could say the sound of ether not only can explain and give a clear understanding of or experience of all the other external senses, but also it is the connecting element to the internal subtle elements. So you could say when you hear a story, there might be all kinds of, you could say, graphical descriptions of just, sensory experiences or, shapes, forms, landscapes. And just by hearing it, you are perceiving everything. But beyond that, also it will create certain emotions in your consciousness by hearing. When you hear something, you might become sad, angry, surprised, anything like that. So the sound is the connecting factor also to the subtle internal elements. And if there's a very beautiful song, you might become very happy. If a very aggressive song, you might become very angry. But beyond that, Shabda Brahman, transcendental sound, actually can cross, it says, the entire sensual, mental and intellectual plane even. So the ear is paramount and most important amongst the senses, very important to hear. And the next list that we have here of the working senses and knowledge acquiring senses is also very interesting. So we have, generally we think we only have 5 senses, but in reality we have 10. So the first 5 are very obvious because they're directly related to the 5 elements. We have the organs of action. So auditory is the first one, hearing, ears. Then the senses of taste, the tongue. The tactile senses, touch. The sense of sight, the eyes. The sense of smell, the nose. And the sense of, that's it. So these are the knowledge acquiring senses. Through those 5 senses we gather information. We are gathering information. They're called Gyanendriyas. So we gather information, knowledge, Jnana. And the more we taste and touch and see the world, we have this stored information, and we generally know what is good, what is bad, what you should touch, what you should not touch. You learn usually either you heard by hearing or by experience. If your mother tells you don't touch this flame, but it looks so beautiful, you want to touch it. So then you go and touch it, and then okay, I shouldn't touch it. My mother was right. So like that, we gather knowledge. Things that are we know which things are pleasant and which we want to taste, eat. Or feel and see, and we know which things we want to avoid. But what is not commonly understood is the next set of senses, the active senses, the senses of action, or the karma indriyas, the senses of action. So then it says, the first one is the active organ of speaking, active organ for speaking. And among those is the tongue is the second most important. So the ear we already highlighted, very important to what you hear, what input you have is the most, you could say, it's through the ear. But the tongue is considered to be the most difficult to control and to discipline, because it has a double activity. So the tongue is doing 2 things. It's an active organ of action, so you can speak with the tongue, but also with the tongue you can taste. So it has double double power, you could say, or two sides activities. And these two activities are related to one of them to the more subtle aspects of our existence, and the other to the more gross aspects of our existence. So in its ability to taste and eat, it's related to the external body. So we learn this in the Nectar of Instruction. We have this very famous verse, Vacha Vegam Manasakroda Vegam, Jiva Vegam Udarupasta Vegam. So in the first line, it says Vacha Vegam. So in the power of speaking, if you control your speech, how you speak, what you speak, and it says you should speak truthful, you should speak the truth, you should speak pleasant words, etc. Then if you speak properly, Vacha Vegam, Mana Sakroda Vegam. You can control your mind and you can control your anger. So that's why Srila Prabhupada very often emphasized, Krishna Katha or Hari Katha. The more we engage our tongue in, spiritual speaking about spiritual topics or chanting, singing about Krishna, naturally our mind and our internal consciousness will be purified and satisfied and spiritualized. If we engage in Gramya Katha, and criticizing people, in talking bad about other devotees or people in general, or we get too immersed in all kinds of worldly topics, naturally our minds will be more disturbed and we will be prone to anger and, you could say, mental instability. And then the second line is Jiva Vegam Udarupasta Vegam. So Jiva is the tongue in its ability to taste. So Jiva Vegam, if you don't control the tongue, then your entire gross body will not be controlled. So it's like a line, you could say. It's the tongue, the belly, and the genitals are considered to be connected. So therefore, if you want to be a brahmachari, it's recommended, paneer only maximum once or 3 times a week, too spicy, too sweet, not so good for a brahmachari. There is a direct connection between the tongue, the belly, and the genitals. The more pressure there is on the belly and genitals, or you could say the less control there is on the appetite the tongue has, also the sexual appetite will proportionally increase. Or you could say the other way, to the level that you manage to control your the appetite of the tongue, to that level there's also a relation to how you will be able to control your sexual appetite. And to the level that you control your appetite, the appetite of the tongue to eat and taste, to that level you also will be more healthy and able to control the appetite for sexual pleasure. So this is directly mentioned, and as the separation. Jiva Vegam, the urge, of the tongue to taste, and Vacha Vegam, the urge to speak. Those two need to be purified and engaged properly. And if you do, then you can accept disciples all over the world, it says. So technically that's one of the key disciplines, the tongue, what you speak and what you eat. So already if we chant regularly and if we take Krishna Prasadam, we already are on a very good track, you could say. But even there, in the Nectar of Devotion, Srila Prabhupada makes a few very interesting statements. He said, for example, this purport, Prabhupada says that if you go to a householder, if a renunciate or brahmachari goes to a householder just with the intention to enjoy the food, not really, sweet rice, yeah. If he just goes there with intention just to enjoy the food, then actually that prasad becomes bhoga. Because the word bhoga and prasada are not just, you could say mechanical terms, Kalamakana Maharaj always used to emphasize this, that when you offer prasadam, it's not that the altar is like a microwave, It's like you put the bhoga into the microwave, into the altar, you close the curtains, and then bing, 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 prasadam, you know. But actually, bhoga means enjoyment. Bhoga means enjoyment. So bhoga is for Krishna. If we offer the bhoga to Krishna, and we have this attitude, we want to please Krishna. Krishna is the enjoyer. You know? He enjoys the bhoga, and we receive prasad. So what we receive then is mercy, you know, blessed food. Prasadaha actually means also something like glad, enlightenment. You know, prasad is something that elevates you. You know, in the Yoga Sutras, prasadaha is described as a stage of consciousness. You know, when you are aware of, you know, your spiritual nature and the nature of the super soul, you feel prasadaha. You know, so prasadam is not just eating food. Prasada is when we get blessings of Krishna. You know, so prasada could be any item that has been in contact with Krishna, or just getting the darshan of Krishna, getting, you know, blessings from Krishna. That's prasadaha. So therefore, what Prabhupada emphasizes in Nectar of Instruction is that the attitude is paramount, you know, when we accept prasadam. You know? So if our mentality is to enjoy only, then even it's prasadam, it might work. It might have the effect of bhoga, you know, because our attitude is not correct. Of course, technically speaking, it is also said, Prabhupada has many quotes, you know, that if you distribute prasadam to people, already they will have such a benefit that they will not be born again in animal kingdom. You know? So Prabhupada makes also statements like that. So there's certainly a benefit to always eat prasadam, no matter in what consciousness. But in the Nectar of Instruction, in connection to, you know, Jiva Vegam and Vacha Vegam, Srila Prabhupada emphasizes strongly that prasadam is the attitude. You know? So, for example, when you get food directly from nature, you know, from a tree, it says when you get food directly from a tree, it's not required for you to actually make a full offering. You know? So you can accept this directly as prasadam. You know, this is prasadam, and technically there is this, you know, the short version, you know, of offering food. Shri Vishnu, Shri Vishnu, Shri Vishnu. You know, it says water, fruits, whatever is already supplied by nature, you can directly accept it as mercy. You know, so if you have the right attitude, that's prasadam. You know, but if you make, you know, a big elaborate, you know, cooking, and the whole time you're thinking, you know, how you're going to enjoy it, you know, and you add a little bit extra of this, like smell, it's good, it's going to turn out. So the attitude is what makes the difference, you know. And generally that's the rule also, that anything that is prepared, you know, that you're prepared, not directly taken from nature, that should be offered also elaborately. And whatever is already provided by nature, like it says milk, water, fruits, you know, unprepared, you can accept directly as prasadam. And just acknowledge, you know, Shri Vishnu, Shri Vishnu, Shri Vishnu. Thank you, my Lord. You know? Yes, the active organ of speaking and the organ of taste, the sense of taste. The tongue is the key, you know, in many ways, you could say. The tongue and the ear, you know, Shravanam Kirtan, therefore. Then we have the active organs of working. These are the hands, you know, the active organs of working. You know, it's incredible what we can do with the hands and arms, you know. You know, everything we see around us, you know, has somehow been shaped by human hands, you know. All these buildings, the landscapes, roads, everything, you know. The active organs of working. And I read once a very interesting long article about, you know, the hands, you know, from the point of view of materialistic evolution. But still, there were many interesting facts about the hands, you know, how fast they can move. You know, you can move your hand for a short distance, but you can move it very, very fast, you know, up to, I think, 500 kilometers per hour, you know, like tick, 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 tick. And then you can, the precision, you know, the hands can have, you know, the different levels of precision, different people, but there are many human hands that have an extreme level of precision, and still they're trying to make machines that have, you know, this level of precision as many human hands. And the hands can be, you know, very adjust, you know, very, I say precise, you know, pressure, you know, you can caress somebody with your hand, you can beat somebody with your hand, you know. So amazing tool, very powerful. Hence, the working senses, the organs of working. Then the organs of traveling, the legs, the organs of traveling. We can walk and cover distances. And then we have the organs of generating. These are the sexual organs of generation, and the organs of evacuating, to get rid of waste. So this together are the 10 senses, the senses of acquiring knowledge and the senses of activity or working. So all of this put together, those 20 senses or 20 elements make up the material body. So when we say, I am not this body, technically we should ideally be conscious of all those 20 elements, All of this we are not, All of this is just, you could say, a mechanism that is taking place. And that's, of course, this is the beginning now. In the further chapters, it will be explained in great detail, how those elements interact with the modes of material nature, how they manifest from, subtle to gross, etc. So, and then in the last verse, where we have the purport as well, Srila Prabhupada is talking about, or the verse is first talking about the internal subtle senses. Are experienced as having 4 aspects in the shape of mind, intelligence, ego, and contaminated consciousness. So manor, buddhir, ahankaras, and then it says chitam anta atmakaha, the internal subtle chatur down. So it's very interesting because usually we have the understanding, of the 3 subtle, mind, intelligence, ahankara, but here chittam is not. It's listed as a separate 4th, subtle internal element or sense. That's very interesting because there is in different situations and different contexts, the false ego is emphasized in a different way. In the Yoga Sutras, the emphasis is like this, that you're supposed to have pure discrimination. Avidya means when we forget, avidya, we sing every day, Sharira avidya jal, So avidya is this body, this material existence, material reality, when we forget who we really are, or when we have no understanding, no conception of what's actually happening, avidya. So to transform or to go beyond avidya, in the Yoga Sutras, it's recommended uninterrupted discrimination between the seer and what it sees. So to have discrimination between your consciousness, and what we are observing. And then it goes further and it says, and then even we are, you are the seer, you can also see yourself. So there's not a difference. Ultimately, the self even is, you could say, even the seer is generally what is observing is different from itself. At one point, you can observe yourself, but that is true, that is real. So, like that. So, and then therefore, then the list it's focused on the first 7 elements, up to intelligence. That we should discriminate. Pure discrimination on those 7 levels of existence. Earth, water, fire, earth, ether, mind, and intelligence. And ego is already the active element of observing either the externals, and understanding that we are not this, and then ego becoming purified and realizing itself. Pure ego, you could say, or atma, the true self, or chitta. In other contexts, chitta is actually divided into those 3 aspects. So chitta would be, the internal elements. Those are chittam, and chittam is made up of manas, buddhi, and ahankara. Those 3 combined would be chitta. So that's also another explanation. Or another explanation is consciousness as the direct, you could say, quality of the soul. So the soul is emanating chitta, consciousness, and therefore we sing every morning. How does it go? Shri Guru Chitete Koriya Aikya. I want my Mukha Padma. So I want my consciousness to become one with the words emanating from the lotus mouth of the spiritual master. So the consciousness being the, you could say, active quality of the soul, that technically is pure, but might be contaminated. Like Prabhupada is translating chitta here as contaminated consciousness. So if it's a material element, it's contaminated consciousness. The moment this consciousness becomes focused on transcendence, or like in the song we sing, becomes one, with the words of the spiritual master, then it becomes purified. It becomes pure consciousness. So the three internal subtle senses, as they are described here, are in direct, you could say, connection with the external senses. There's a correlation, and in one sense, the ears we already talked about. How by hearing what you hear has a direct effect in how you internally feel. But ultimately, any perception through the external senses will be processed in the subtle internal elements. So, or especially in the mind. The mind is considered to be the control center for all sensory activities. So all sensory activities, all sensory perceptions that we have are processed in the mind, and the mind at the same time is directing the senses to act and to interact. But it's very likely that the senses will be, you could say, pulling the mind in all kinds of directions. And the mind is not rational. The mind is emotional. So the mind will just react. It has feelings, emotions, it has desires, it has thoughts. So the mind is generally just interacts and controls the senses. Above the mind, we have, of course, the intelligence. And the intelligence, the buddhi, would be the ability to control the mind. Planning and discrimination are its two activities. So the mind should direct, the intelligence should direct the mind how to accept and reject. So the mind is described as having 5 main functions: feeling, thinking, and willing. And then we accept and reject. We accept and reject. So this accepting and rejecting can be either, you could say, conditioned and forced, by the senses. If the senses want something, you just do it. Why? Because we identify with the senses. So in the Yoga Sutras also that's defined very nicely. It says yoga is the process of stopping the chittam, those 3 aspects, from pulling you around. And one should learn to discriminate. 1 second. Yoga Chittam Vritti Nirodha. Sarupyam Taratra. So if you perform yoga properly, then what happens is you realize the nature of the true self, Svarupam. And if you don't, then Sarupyam. So Sarupyam and Sarupa are, you could say, the two opposites. Svarupa is who we really are, what we should be doing. And Sarupyam is what we think we are. So if you are not practicing yoga, if you're not trying to control the senses, if you're not trying to, or practicing some form of mental discipline or yoga, then it's most likely that any sensation that comes from the senses will be sarupyam. That means you think, that's me. It's me, therefore I have to do it because that's what I want. So yoga means to understand, maybe it's not what I really want, Maybe it's what my senses want. So this ability to discriminate between what is really good for me, what is really beneficial for me, ultimately, and what might be just a sensation and an urge that might not be at all beneficial for me. That you could say that is yoga. So the mind has to make this decision, or the mind is making these decisions constantly. What we do, what we don't do. Do I remain seated or do I stand up? Like, no, I remain seated. It's nice and comfortable. And the intelligence told Björn, no, stand up. You're falling asleep. So that's the idea. Intelligence is technically a higher, in the hierarchy, it's higher than the mind. But if the mind and consciousness is completely externally disposed, then you can expect that the mind and the senses will tyrannize and subjugate intelligence. And then intelligence becomes enslaved to fulfill and arrange all the needs of the senses and the mind. You can also make plans. You also discriminate, between what items you will choose, what items you will take. What's best to enjoy. You always have to plan and discriminate. But you can plan and discriminate on a higher level for a higher purpose. And that's the ideal position of the intelligence. Intelligence, of course, needs to be educated. And the more intelligence is educated with spiritual knowledge, intelligence gains the ability to clearly discriminate. So also, I think in the 4th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, Srila Prabhupada describes intelligence as the element that gives the ability to see everything. As you can see through pure intelligence, you can perceive the self as well. So pure intelligence also can help transcend the false ego. Because technically the false ego is false. It's not real. So the more we have purified intelligence, we act in such a way that we are not anymore acting as the false ego, but acting from the level of the pure, you could say, soul. Or you could say like this also, all the external elements, all these elements, buddhi, mana, and all the external, bodily elements and senses, they are material, but if you engage them in Krishna's service, they can be spiritualized. So this is always a big mystery. How is it that our senses are spiritualized? And in one sense you could say it's very simple, because it depends on the position of the intelligence. If the intelligence is clearly identifying or connected with the soul, then all the activities the intelligence and the mind perform with this body are spiritual. So the senses, or let's say in general, material energy is not material ultimately. Srila Prabhupada says that very often, that material energy is only when we think something is separate from Krishna. Then it's material energy. If our intelligence is conscious to such a level that we perform all our activities in the consciousness that we want to serve Krishna, we want to please Krishna, then the intelligence, the mind, and the senses are spiritual. So therefore we worship, the body of a deceased devotee. We don't burn it. Normal body, it's burned. The body of a spiritual, of a great personality like Srila Prabhupada, we also have the Pushpa Samadhi and also the full Samadhi of Srila Prabhupada in Vrindavan. The bodies of such personalities are not burned, because we consider this body to be spiritual. Because Srila Prabhupada was conscious in all his activities. So not only his body, but even all the items that he used, are also considered to have this, let me say, spiritual quality. They are spiritualized. So like that, I think it's in the 4th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam. I generally quote from the 4th canto because it's the canto that I studied best as a brahmachari. And there Prabhupada is describing that the buddhi can basically see directly the spiritual soul. And then this ahankara, this false ego, is, you could say, this mirror that's distracting us from seeing our true self. You could say the ahankara is sometimes described as the mirror that's focusing outwards. The ego is always telling us out there. It's outside. The senses. And once we cross the false ego, we can see actually everything is happening internally. The internal reality is the true nature. Actually, external reality is material and is temporary, and it's actually only a reflection, of the true, the reality, the true nature, our true home. You could also say. Okay, I think I'll stop here. Oh, sorry, almost 9 already. Okay, maybe there's some questions, comments. Chandrasekhar Prabhu.
Thank you for your really nice realizations. Just a small light-hearted comment. You quoted this famous Rupa Goswami verse, Vacho Vegam Manasakroda Vegam. So if anyone, any devotee, you know where I'm going with this?
Maybe.
If any devotee claims that, devotees should not eat Italian cuisine, you have a counter argument right from Rupa Goswami, because he says, Vacho Vegam Manasakroda Vegam, Udaro pasta vegam. So he quotes the word of pasta. Similarly, Bhaktivinoda, if you like Mexican food but you feel guilty, Bhaktivinoda Thakur says, grihe taco, vane taco.
Jai. Yes. No, I remember once I was talking to one devotee in Dominican Republic, and I was this was the Govinda restaurant, and making pizza, and I was like, yeah, in the spiritual world maybe there is no pizza, so maybe this is not like traditional food. And he was like, what? He was like, are there tomatoes in the spiritual world? I'm like, yeah, of course. Are there cows in the spiritual world? Yeah. Are there chapatis in the spiritual world? He was like, yeah, of course there's pizza in the spiritual world. Yeah, thank you very much. Grantarat Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.